Welcome to this video talk. It's actually Monday. Well, you're most welcome to this video talk. It's actually Monday morning, the 10th of January. Now, there's been a lot of alarm communicated to me. Sometimes alarm, sometimes curiosity, but about this Deltacron variant, so-called Deltacron variant, which is a nickname. Now, it is quite possible when someone's infected with two variants, for example, Delta and Omicron at the same time, that both of these virus variants could get into a single cell and their genetics could be mixed up and you could have a new viral form produced. That could happen. That is possible. And some scientists in Cyprus are saying that's happening. They've called it Deltacron. They're saying it's been found more in hospitalised patients. So the intimation there is it's more pathogenic, that it's making people sicker. And of course, if it's Omicron, it's going to spread all around the world. So is there going to be a terrible pandemic spreading all around the world of a highly contagious and yet still highly pathogenic variant? Well, if you haven't got time to watch this video in detail, the answer is no, there's not. I'm convinced there's not. There is a bit of argument around that, but my view at the moment is there's no evidence for this. So if you haven't got time to watch, then fine, just watch the rest after work or something. But let's look at that now. So Deltacron is the question mark. Now, of course, names are given by the World Health Organization in their wisdom. So this would just be a nickname that's been sort of tagged onto that for the time being. Now, this only comes from Cyprus as far as we know. We don't believe it is a new form of coronavirus. I don't think it is. Now, recombination events can occur, as we've said, inside a single cell. Now, this has happened before. There is precedent for this. So a person can be infected with two forms of the coronavirus and you can get a hybrid form. This has happened. But they've never really taken off. They've always been sort of more or less curiosities. Maybe a few tens of cases that have been identified by genomic sequencing, then it's died out. So, for example, when Delta was replacing Alpha, we didn't have a combination of Alpha and Delta. Or indeed, when Alpha was replacing the B11 original Wuhan strain, again, we didn't have a recombination there. So I don't think there's any particular strong reason now why we should have a combination of Delta and Omicron. Although we do have the two coexisting at the moment, so it is possible, but it doesn't seem to have happened is the bottom line at the moment. Looks like this might be lab contamination. That's the most likely outcome. Now, this comes from Professor Leodis Kostrikos, a professor of biological sciences, University of Cyprus, head of the Laboratory of Biotechnology and Molecular Virology. So basically, it sounds like this is the big cheese in Cyprus. Suggested Delta and Omicron variants had amalgamated. We don't think so, actually. There are currently Omicron and Delta co-infections, and we found this strain that is a combination of these two, the professor claims. And more people with it were found in hospitalised patients, indicating it might be more pathogenic, which is what concerns a lot of you. 25 of these sequences have been submitted to this grouping here, GISAID, which is the it's like an international body that where people lodge all of the genomic sequences that have been put forward. So it's been lodged there as like an official genomic sequence. But is it? Dr. Thomas Peacock for London, infectious diseases. November, there was a very small cluster of cases in November that Dr. Peacock said had a really awful spike mutation profile, and it turned out to be Omicron. So this guy's got a pretty good track record. First in the UK to identify in fact, I think in the world to identify the first genomically sequenced in South Africa, of course, but he's the first that seems to have decoded this, along with South African scientists. And he was right, it's Omicron. But as we know, it's turning out not as bad as we thought, or not as bad as many had feared. So Deltacron genetic profile, he says, Dr. Peacock says, looks quite clearly contamination. So quite clearly he thinks it's contamination. And as we've said, this is a guy with a bit of a good track record. Several colleagues, in other words, he's asked around his mates at Imperial College by the sound of it, probably other institutions. Almost definitely contamination, they agree. So we are at an early stage. Doesn't look like a real combination is the consensus of opinion from Dr. Peacock and his colleagues. Dr. Simon Clark, University of Reading. It's perfectly possible for different versions of the virus that cause COVID-19 to combine sections of their genetic material. So this can happen when people, because of course, when Delta is on the way out and Omicron's on the way in, you're going to get both viruses around for a period of time. Although that period didn't last long with Omicron, because the Omicron has so outcompeted the Delta that in the UK, Delta's probably down to about 3 or 4% of cases now. So there's not a lot of these around, but it's still quite possible. It is theoretically possible. So that would create a recombinant, he correctly says. It's quite possible, and indeed it has happened before. Which is a genetic mosaic of different variants. It's possible with altered characteristics. So a reshuffling of the cards can give you a different hand. But they contain a number of telltale signs, and Deltacron just doesn't have any. So it just doesn't have the signs that would indicate that has happened. Instead, its proposed genetic code looks more like what would happen if you contaminated one sample with another. It looks like it's this simple. That could have happened at any point between sampling and sequencing in the laboratory, and I strongly suspect this is what happened. New variants will continue to come along, but I don't think this is one. So that looks likely. Deltacron's genetic code. He also says scars of a notoriously faulty primer. So this is kind of a known technique called V372 amplicron, which is one of the agents used in it. And it looks like this has damaged the Delta and caused this mix-up with some Omicron sample. As of Monday morning, I've just checked it out. As of Monday morning, the United Kingdom Health Security Agency, no new variants are under surveillance, and that was of about 20 past 10 English time, British time, Monday morning. Now, Professor Kostrikis doesn't quite accept this. Indicate an evolutionary pressure on an ancestral form to acquire these mutations and not a result of a single recombinant event. Well, yes, but we don't think it is a single recombinant event. We think it's contamination, Professor. So looks like that's probably not a valid point. And this was in an email from the professor yesterday in response to the words from the British scientist. Deltacron infection is higher amongst hospital patients for COVID-19 than amongst non-hospital patients. Yes, but how many? Is it 25 to 0? So 25 were found in hospital patients, 0 were found in community patients, or is it? What is it? Is it 20 to 5? We have no idea. We just know it's a majority. So it doesn't tell us anything. And even so, suppose it was like 15 there and 10 there, then with that size of sample, that wouldn't be statistically significant anyway. So I don't think that's really a valid point unless we're giving further data. So that rules out the contamination hypothesis. The professor says, well, the majority of virological opinion disagrees with Professor Kostrikis at this point. The samples were processed in multiple sequencing procedures in more than one country. Now, this is a very powerful argument Professor Kostrikis puts forward here. If this result is duplicated in different labs using different techniques, then it would be more of a concern. And he's saying that's happened, but we don't have any details on that, so we can't comment further. He said at least one sequence from Israel deposited in a global database exhibits genetic characteristics of Deltacron. So he's saying that this is a sample that presumably has got to his lab from Israel. But again, if it's gone through his procedures, then it's just as likely to be a mistake. There's something going wrong in that particular lab. So he does say there this has been repeated in other countries. If that's the case, we await further detail on that. Very interested to see what the Danish scientists are going to say on this, because, of course, we know that they're world leaders in genomic sequencing. But I think the overwhelming balance of opinion and the overwhelming balance of likelihood, based on the precedents we've had in the last 2 years now, really, getting on for 2 years this month, of this pandemic, what we've been learning about it, it indicates that this is indeed just a contamination event and there's no such thing as Deltacron. Therefore, I am not remotely concerned about it at the moment. We'll give the last word to Professor Nick Lohman, microbial genomics professor, University of Birmingham. While a recombination form of Delta and Omicron would not be a complete surprise, the finding from Cyprus is more likely a technical artifact that arose in the process of sequencing the viral genome. So there you go. It looks like the balance of opinion at the moment is Deltacron is non-existent. There is no new variant which is found in hospital patients, therefore seems to be making people sicker, yet is potentially as transmissible as Omicron. It does not seem to exist. If it does, if there's evidence otherwise, I will be on it as soon as I can. It's a pretty important potential development in the pandemic, but I think there's no story there, and I'm not worried, and I don't think Deltacron exists at the moment. Of course, we will correct it as soon as we can if we find out anything else. But at the moment, I'm going to forget about it. Thank you for watching.